We have one more panel set before break time. This will be on data quality with Gen AI and beyond, presented by Avias with Bank of America, Braden with BCG, and Susan with Microsoft. Give them a round of applause.
Okay, here we go. We are going to talk about data quality and a whole bunch of other stuff. I am pleased to introduce both Avias and Braden. Avias from Bank of America, Braden from Boston Consulting Group. And, as I've been thinking about this panel, I was thinking about last year at this very same event, and it felt like we were all thinking about what is going on? What does this generative AI platform shift mean? What should we be doing? And it feels a lot to me like this year, this moment, we're thinking a lot more about the how. It just feels like we are so much more focused on we've kind of figured it out in terms of what's happening. Things continue to shift, but we're really getting into the how. And one of the big hows is, of course, data. And I'm curious, Avias, just starting with you, kind of where are you in your thinking on this topic? And then Braden, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think where we feel we are now as an industry is we've had a couple of years to really test out different technologies, understand what our business use cases are, and then get into that experimentation to figure out where the best product fit is, where we can quantify and have a tangible business case. I think it's very much driven by the use cases and where and how, what kind of deployment would work best for that, and then being very deliberate, being very security and governance first in any sort of implementation or scaling.
And is that different, though, from the way that you approached development in the past, or is it pretty much the same?
I wouldn't say it's different, but it certainly does have its unique challenges. So just to give examples, the way you would think about things like explainability, auditability, bias, you certainly need to have new measures and frameworks to quantify that. I would say translating the governance framework invested at the data layer and how that translates into kind of your AI applications, especially things like identity and access management, that certainly presents a challenge. I would say getting data ready in a way. Having the data ready means a few different things, which we can talk about in more detail, for that to be meaningful for the applications that you want to put on top. Whether they be RAG or agentic systems, that certainly needs to be invested in. And then I would say, just zooming out, I would say what's different here is the fact that executive management or boards are quite focused on driving AI driven value creation within enterprises. Usually you wouldn't see kind of board getting so excited about new technologies. So that's different with AI, just because of the amount of airtime it gets. And then there's a whole people and change management element to it. I won't say it's very different, but certainly just because of how new the technology is, requires very careful planning and investment.
Braden, what's your view?
Yeah, it's interesting. You go back a year, and I think there was very much a focus on specific use cases where the ROI was known and you could develop a playbook for deployment. So generative engineering, contact center automation, customer support, enterprise search. There's sort of known tools you could deploy. A lot of the work that we did at BCG, sort of across our client base, was helping companies think through those deployments. As you've gotten a couple years in, you've gotten to the stage where things feel harder. And part of the reason it's harder is not just a technology problem, it's that you need to think about what you're doing and what you're solving for before you build it. And we often find for companies that's actually the harder part versus just the technology. To give an example, I was having a discussion with one of my clients about deploying agents into their organization. What does this actually mean, right? What data do you want to expose? How do you know what data should be exposed? What types of data? Do you know where it is? If an agent runs, does it inherit the permissions of the person running it? How do you worry about insider threat in an environment where you're deploying these agents? How do you manage budgets per person? Are traditional application owners the owners of agents that touch on applications? So there's all of these questions which are fundamental that the technology doesn't solve for you. And I think we're now at the stage where the people and process and design is intersecting with the technology, and organizations are going through the pain of thinking through that.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, I was looking at the Gartner hype cycle for AI this past year versus the prior year, and one of the things that I noticed was that there was a new category, which was AI-ready data, and it made me think about, like, why was that not there last year? And it feels as though there are characteristics of what AI-ready means that are novel, that are new with generative AI that we hadn't thought about before. So let's get into that. I mean, because I think, we all have known since the beginning of time that, data fuels AI. There are also ways in which generative AI can help you reason over your data. But how, and Aves, let's start with you, but like, how do you think about the modern data estate today, and sort of what do you think are the kind of upcoming issues we should be thinking about more broadly? And of course, from the perspective of an organization in a highly regulated industry, you've had some time to think about this.
I would say there are certainly, I mean, the way I would characterize them is, I would say the availability of the data. I would say the first one, having the right data available for the applications. The other element is the governance around the data. And the governance would mean a few different things, but having access to kind of clean data, depending on what the data is being used for, understanding the biases within that data, and then security and controls around access management, who can see what, making sure that the access controls you have in place for data governance in general kind of translate into the applications. And then I would say kind of you go into, as you think about productionizing and scaling the applications, just thinking through issues of, are you able to kind of serve the models with the data and scale it in a way that you can kind of solve for kind of latency issues. And then clearly, as the deployments kind of become more mature, thinking about model drift as some of the new data comes in, and you kind of evolve the model over time. Does it still serve the purpose? Hit the right metrics in terms of kind of accuracy and reliability. So those are just kind of high level some of the aspects on the data side.
Something we've seen clients who are really successful engage with AI is that they have collected data historically that was very hard to use, and now have identified new ways of using it. So to give you an example, worked with one of my private equity clients, retail and consumer portfolio companies. They'd collected a huge amount of customer feedback in written form. People churn, they had complaints about the product, positive feedback. Really, really difficult to do anything useful with this at scale, because over the last decade, NLP techniques, you could do sort of sentiment analysis, you could search for key terms, but it really wasn't there. And they found that they had this estate of data which could now be interpreted by LLMs. They could extract qualitative insights that are actually extremely valuable to their product teams, which would have been impossible 5 years ago to do in any other way than having humans manually read these millions of entries. And so I think the broader lesson here is that data are not monolithic, right? You have everything from transaction records to documents to customer feedback to trace data which is produced in the course of application development and a million other types of data. And the way that you handle these things, whether they should be on-prem or in the cloud, whether they should be repatriated, the right framework to engage with them, is inconsistent, and it varies by the type of data, and it varies by what you want to do with it, which goes back to sort of the point, you need to decide what you're designing and make these sort of first principles decisions about the objective before you dive in. And I think where we have seen programs go wrong around data management in enterprises is there's this top-down mandate, aggregate our data and do AI on it. And if you don't know what problem you're solving, it's really hard to solve the problem.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I have a little bit of, let's just say, deja vu about this, given that, early on I was pretty interested in social media data, right? In all that unstructured sort of literal voice of the customer data. And of course, back in those days, there were three categories: positive, negative, and neutral. And typically positive was around 10%, and negative was around 10%, and neutral was about 80%. And neutral just basically meant we don't know. We don't know what it means. And so, clearly the technology has gotten much better, so you can pull that data out. You can start to understand what's there. You can actually see some really surprising things. One of the gating factors, I think, is actually the imagination to do it, right? And so one of the things I think as an industry that's really interesting is like, how can we help each other sort of figure out what are the best approaches, what are the best prompts, what are the best ways of thinking about that kind of change? Because I've definitely heard both from business leaders and devs and other people that once you're in it, you start getting that sense of the art of the possible, which is I think it's a balancing act between that and coming in with a clear sense of what you're trying to solve for. So let's say you're trying to solve for customer experience. This is an appropriate case, but you don't always know. You may find something else in the process. So how do you counsel your clients to kind of wade through that and prioritize?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because top-down mandates can stifle innovation. You don't want people who are actually engaging with the data, experimenting with the systems, to feel dictated to and how they have to solve the problem. But at the same time, if you're too open-minded, your brain will fall out. And some of that also tends to happen in these situations where teams which are just left to innovate in a silo will actually not drive to business outcomes. So where we've seen a lot of success, and the way that we do this internally at BCG for some of our own AI initiatives, is you have clear mandates for what you're trying to solve for, like the North Star objectives of the program, be that customer satisfaction, improving efficiency of project delivery. But you want to allow a lot of innovation at the working team level with the people actually experimenting with the tool, and then be rigorous around capturing and measuring and cross-pollinating what's discovered. So this is process which enables innovation while keeping the end objective in mind, and it can fall apart, I think, at any of those three stages.
Okay, so is that consistent with your experience too? Are you seeing more of that kind of inter-stakeholder collaboration, or are your processes fairly similar to where they were? Like, how are you thinking about it?
I think collaboration is key. Actually, you probably need a lot closer alignment. There's a lot of collective learning, and just making sure. I think the interesting thing is the technology is new for everyone.
Yeah.
The other interesting element here is that the end users of the applications are actually fairly advanced. We all in our daily lives are users of chat applications out there. So I think the users have become quite sophisticated. So in terms of kind of training, or you don't need to push it to the end users. But that also means that it becomes a very collaborative process to drive. I think it's you kind of need to figure out really the elements of implementation and scaling, which become the challenge. But I think in terms of the other unique element, other than having I would say the executive imperative, is that there's a lot of, I would say, ask from the end users for the technology. So I would agree with that.
Yeah. It's funny. I was talking to somebody not too long ago for a podcast episode, and she was like, I grew up in waterfall Six Sigma land, and letting go of that has been so hard. And I think, we talk a lot about skilling, and we talk about skilling with regard to tooling and things like that, and learning techniques and approaches like RAG, et cetera. But I feel like we don't talk enough about, like, how do we let go of the kind of frameworks of the past and adapt frameworks that help us balance the laser focus on business outcomes with the need for innovation, with the need, not all to be throwing crayons at each other in the sandbox. And so, anyway, I have no answer, but I think it's an interesting question. Let's move to the cloud. I mean, the cloud is now, so today's my son's birthday, he's 22. The cloud is almost as old, or yeah, a little bit younger. I'm just counting to 2005 randomly, but, where do you think we are from a cloud perspective? What do you think needs to happen with the way that we think about cloud in order to enable this next shift? And Avais, let's start with you.
I would say that cloud has had very strong momentum. Really, kind of over the last 20 years, we now stand at about 40% enterprise penetration of cloud, which seems like there's some ways to go, but by a lot of measures, it has become a fairly mature part of the stack, and with that comes a lot of positive kind of elements which were kind of initial roadblocks for adoption. I would say AI offers a very interesting leg to that, where some of the challenges around scaling are kind of abstracted away in a sense. It allows a quick way for one to, as you say, kind of sandbox and test out different technologies before you can think through some infrastructure issues. Having said that, I think there are some kind of different factors, whether it pertains to cost or security, that we've seen. I would say kind of folks either moving to hybrid or putting some workloads on-prem. I would say there's now certain technologies that allow one to do that within your own deployment, especially for scaled organizations. So that's certainly been one agenda. I would say cloud still remains a pretty good way of kind of testing and experimenting with AI models. But I would say more range of options exist now on infrastructure deployment. I would say vendors deeper down in the infrastructure stack have been making it easier to test out different things, all the way to kind of the NVIDIAs and the AMDs of the world, to kind of make it easier for you to kind of test different models, and different deployment modalities, and be more, I would say, heterogeneous with your deployment. So yeah, those are some of the observations on the infrastructure side, I would say.
Something I find really interesting about cloud is that there are a lot more cloud compute providers now than there were 3 years ago. There's sort of, it used to be you had 3 options, and now there are more than 3 options. And I don't mean to denigrate those 3 options, at all, but there just is more choice now. I think that has interesting implications for how you think about where you deploy AI and how that intersects with your data. So if your data is on a cloud provider and you can buy competitive compute from that cloud provider and they offer the models that you want, I think a lot of our clients are in that boat, and that is where they're going to deploy, and the data gravity and the compute provided against that data is sufficient, and there's not going to be repatriation. They're not going to think about moving. But as you get into a situation where the cost of deploying AI, and particularly if your stack involves deployment or customization of open source models rather than API calls to closed source models, you have neo-cloud providers, alternatives to traditional hyperscalers, and they may be more cost competitive on compute, and the trade-off is that they are not optimized for data storage. They're maybe not optimized for the full range of platform services that a hyperscaler offers. And so does the compute cost make it worth it to you to incur the headache of using open source models, of migrating your data? Just the frontier of choices that people confront now is a lot wider than it was 3 years ago. And so that, in general, most workloads will happen on the cloud, I think is true and will likely remain true and become increasingly true. But which clouds it happen in and how customers make that choice, I think is a lot more complicated than it used to be.
Thank you. So let's wrap up. We've talked about, in our little prep call, we talked about sort of your playbooks for change. And so I'd love to hear from both of you. Braden, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Avais, on sort of how you're thinking about, what's your theory of change for, let's say, the next 18 months, 2 years? What should people be thinking about?
So I think there's two things that you should keep in mind as North Stars. One, the business objectives that you're solving towards, because the specific technology you deploy and how you deploy that technology, that may change month over month as we learn more. But if you have a thing you're solving towards, your organization is aligned to, that gives you something to measure success against. And I think that's really critical for innovation efforts to work. A second related point is that this is deeply organizational. Organizations where people are not aligned to the idea that they need to make AI native to the organization, they hide their data, they keep it on their personal computer, they don't experiment with the tools. You cannot push on a string. You will not make this work if there isn't organizational buy-in. And so this technology doesn't make this not become a people problem.
It's always the people. Calls coming from inside the house. Avais?
Yep. I would say, so totally agree with both of those points. I would say the other element is effectively be fairly deliberate about kind of how you would test and measure against those performance. I think what we've generally seen in the market is people having I would say the budgets or the imperative to kind of go out and test a lot of those technologies. We've seen some of the barriers come down over time related to costs. The performance has improved, reliability has improved. So some things that are possible will be possible tomorrow, are probably not possible today. So things will improve, having that perspective in mind as we're kind of testing some of those elements and closing really the gap between the promise and the reality. I would say that's how we'll probably move forward with a lot of those experimentation going on today.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you all. And have a great rest of your afternoon.